the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
The palace had prepared for elegance, tradition, and one final night of royal unity. What it received instead was a decision capable of freezing an entire room. King Charles had personally altered the most important seating arrangement of his final royal banquet, removing Camilla from the position everyone assumed was hers, and choosing Sophie to occupy the place beside him. It was not merely a chair, it was a message. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew every person understood the weight of that night. This was his personally designated final grand royal banquet, a dinner bringing senior royals, foreign dignitaries, household officials, and trusted figures from his reign around one table. A royal banquet is more than a dinner. It is a carefully ordered ceremony where seating, entrances, speeches, and precedence signal respect, rank, and confidence. That was why one altered chair carried the force of a declaration. Camilla received the revised seating card minutes before the doors were due to open. She read Sophie's name once, then again, as if repetition might somehow change the ink. "Is this correct?" she asked an aide. The queen consort kept her voice low, but the question landed hard. The aide hesitated, glanced toward the corridor, and finally admitted that the arrangement had come directly from the king. She said nothing after that. Sophie felt the shock differently. When a courtier told the Duchess of Edinburgh that Charles wanted her beside him, she initially assumed she was being asked to support Camilla through the evening. The explanation came slowly, painfully. She was not assisting the queen consort. She was occupying the principal ceremonial place beside the monarch, while Camilla would sit farther down the table. Sophie stared at the courtier, then asked whether Charles truly understood what that would mean. William already did. The Prince of Wales noticed the revised plan before the procession formed, and understood this was no clerical adjustment. Charles had marked the change and instructed the Lord Chamberlain, the senior royal household officer, who oversees major ceremonial arrangements, not to alter it. The future king looked toward his father, searching for uncertainty. He found none. Then the final seconds arrived. Camilla watched as Sophie was guided toward Charles's side. The trusted confidant slowed beside the chair, reluctant to sit. Charles met her eyes and gave one nod. She obeyed, and in that single motion, the banquet changed forever. The deeper shock was not that Sophie had been chosen. It was why. Because the reason stretched back to a private incident Camilla believed Charles had already forgotten. To anyone outside the royal household, it might have looked like a seating adjustment. To Charles, Camilla, and Sophie, it carried years of history. One woman had shared the king's private life through extraordinary upheaval. Another had spent decades becoming one of the monarchy's most dependable figures without demanding the spotlight. Now those histories collided at a single banquet table, transforming loyalty, marriage, duty, and trust into something painfully visible. Sophie understood exactly why the chair felt dangerous. As a working royal, meaning a member of the family who regularly carries out official duties on behalf of the crown, she had built her reputation through consistency rather than spectacle. Difficult visits, sensitive conversations, awkward family moments, she handled them without turning herself into the story. Charles had noticed. Again and again, he had seen her protect the dignity of an occasion when emotions threatened to overwhelm it. Camilla carried something Sophie never could. She was the king's wife, his closest personal companion, and the woman who had stood beside him through years of pressure, criticism, and transformation. Her place beside Charles therefore represented more than rank. It represented partnership. That was why being moved farther down the table felt so brutal. Sophie had earned operational trust, the kind of confidence built through calm judgment and reliable service. Camilla believed marriage should carry a deeper claim. Sophie felt trapped by both truths. In a private antechamber, she turned to Edward and said quietly, "I never asked for this." The Duke of Edinburgh, Charles's younger brother and Sophie's husband, understood the fear behind those words. He told her the king knew she had never sought the position. That, Edward said, was exactly why Charles trusted her with it. Sophie did not look reassured. Camilla felt the rejection before the banquet even began. She had imagined this final grand dinner as a public confirmation of everything she and Charles had survived together. Instead, The evening seemed to separate them at the precise moment unity should have been strongest. Worse, she had already noticed Sophie's growing influence. Weeks earlier, she had questioned why the trusted confidant was being invited into difficult family discussions, while she herself was sometimes left outside them. William had noticed the same pattern. The prince had watched his father increasingly ask Sophie for an opinion when he wanted an answer untouched by ambition, rivalry, or personal reward. The future king never mistook that reliance for affection alone. It was confidence. And confidence inside a royal household could become more powerful than rank. Then Sophie turned a corridor corner and found Camilla directly ahead of her. She began softly, telling the queen she had not requested the seat. Camilla stopped her before the explanation could continue. "You didn't need to." She walked away. Sophie remained still, knowing the wound ran deeper than one dinner. The chair was only the visible consequence. The real fracture had begun weeks earlier, during one private ceremony when a single choice from Camilla changed the way Charles looked at both women forever. Weeks before the banquet, there had been no cameras, no cheering crowd, and no public controversy, only a small private ceremony inside Windsor, and a decision that Charles never forgot. It should have been routine, a gathering honoring retiring household staff who had served the crown for decades. Instead, one seemingly minor disagreement exposed two radically different instincts. Camilla wanted the ceremony shortened. Sophie refused to let the departing staff be treated as an inconvenience. Charles cared about that farewell more than most people around him realized. The ceremony honored veteran palace employees, meaning long-serving members of the royal household, who had spent years supporting official duties behind the scenes. Several had worked through more than one reign. Some had known his mother. Others had helped Charles through difficult transitions of his own. He wanted every retirement acknowledged personally, because, to him, loyalty measured in decades deserved more than a hurried goodbye. Camilla saw the problem differently. The program was running late, another engagement was approaching, and she quietly asked whether several individual presentations could be removed. Sophie heard the request and immediately understood what that would mean. Those employees had waited years for this final recognition. She turned to the queen consort and said they should not lose their moment simply because the schedule had become inconvenient. Camilla stiffened. She believed Sophie had crossed a line. In a side room, she reminded the trusted confidant that royal life sometimes required difficult decisions, and that efficiency was part of responsibility. Sophie did not raise her voice. She did not retreat either. "So is gratitude," she answered. Charles entered just in time to hear those words. The king stopped. He looked first at Sophie, then at Camilla, and immediately sensed how far the disagreement had gone. He refused to argue in front of either woman. Instead, he returned every personal presentation to the program. Nobody was removed, nobody was rushed, and as the ceremony continued, he watched Sophie remain with nervous retirees, speak warmly to their spouses, and stay behind even after others had begun leaving. Charles asked for the attendance notes later that evening. Those notes were simply the household record showing who attended and how the ceremony had been arranged. What caught his attention was not a name but a timing detail. Sophie had privately moved part of her own schedule so the departing staff could receive the full ceremony without pressure. That changed something. Charles sat alone afterward with the farewell program beside an early plan for his final royal banquet. He picked up a pen, found Sophie's name, and circled it once. No announcement followed. No explanation was given. Camilla would only understand the meaning weeks later. By then, the words, "So is gratitude," had stayed with Charles long enough to become more than a memory. They had become a judgment, and that judgment was about to confront her directly. Camilla could tolerate whispers. She could tolerate altered schedules and awkward glances. What she could not tolerate was Charles allowing the banquet to begin without explaining why another woman had been placed beside him. Before the formal entrance, she followed the king into a private receiving room and closed the door herself. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the queen asked the question the entire palace was too frightened to voice. Camilla already knew the seating plan was final. The royal procession, the formal entrance of senior members of the family into a major ceremonial event, was only minutes away, and there was no administrative excuse left to hide behind. She had seen the instructions herself. Charles had approved them. He had expected resistance. Yet when she faced him, The king looked tired rather than defensive, as though he had already argued the decision many times in his own mind. Camilla asked him directly whether Sophie had taken her place because of what happened at Windsor. Charles did not retreat. He told the queen consort the banquet was not punishment, it was recognition. He wanted the person beside him to represent the spirit he wanted attached to the evening, and Sophie, in his judgment, had earned that confidence. Camilla absorbed the words like an insult. She reminded Charles of the years she had stood beside him when criticism was relentless, and the future of their relationship seemed uncertain. She had shared burdens Sophie never carried. She had endured public hostility, private strain, and the pressure of becoming queen. How, she asked, could one disagreement over a ceremony outweigh all of that? Charles shook his head. That was not what had happened. The Windsor incident, he explained, had only confirmed something he had been noticing for months. Sophie repeatedly chose duty without trying to shape what duty gave back to her. She did not seek more influence after being trusted. She did not demand public credit after helping. For the king, that mattered. Camilla searched for another explanation. She asked whether William had pushed him toward Sophie, whether the prince had quietly influenced the decision behind closed doors. Charles answered immediately, "No, this was mine." The words removed her final escape. There was no faction to blame, no advisor to attack, no palace machinery to accuse. The decision belonged to her husband. Camilla slowly placed her gloves on the side table. Then she told Charles to look directly at her and say Sophie would still sit beside him after everything she had just said. The king met her eyes. "She will." Camilla walked out knowing she had lost the argument. But the deeper wound was only beginning to form. Charles had not simply moved a chair. He had revealed whose judgment he now trusted when emotion, loyalty, and the future of the monarchy collided. Royal power rarely announces itself with shouting. Sometimes it appears in a handwritten correction, a silent nod, or the person a monarch chooses to hear before making the final call. Charles's choice of Sophie exposed exactly that kind of power. Her influence did not come from rank over Camilla, because she had none. It came from something much harder to manufacture inside a palace, the king's belief that she would protect the institution even when nobody applauded. Charles held the final authority over the ceremonial character of his own banquet. Ceremonial authority simply meant the power to decide how an official royal occasion would be arranged, including who sat where and what message the event carried. That made Sophie's position more than a technical adjustment. It was the king's choice, made deliberately. He had come to value her because she understood public duty without losing sight of private emotion. Sophie did not experience that trust as a victory. She worried about Edward, knowing her husband could be dragged into a dispute he had never sought. She worried about Camilla too. The two women had worked alongside each other for years, and the trusted confidant knew exactly how easily one ceremonial decision could be interpreted as betrayal. Being elevated for one evening suddenly felt less like an honor and more like a test. Edward saw the fear immediately. In a private conversation, the Duke told Sophie that refusing the seat would create an even bigger crisis. Charles had chosen her publicly enough that rejection would embarrass him and make the palace appear divided. Sophie listened, then admitted that accepting might hurt Camilla more than declining would hurt the king. Edward answered quietly that sometimes duty offered no painless option. Charles had already reached the same conclusion. During a private conversation with William, he explained that the banquet was meant to honor service before position. The prince understood those words instantly. They were not decoration for a speech. They explained everything. His father was making a distinction between rank inherited or granted and trust earned through conduct. William then learned something even more striking. Charles had specifically ordered that Sophie's place remain unchanged even if Camilla objected. The future king realized his father had predicted the emotional cost and chosen to accept it rather than soften the message. Sophie stood beside the chair before the banquet began and rested one hand against its back without sitting. Charles noticed her hesitation. "You have earned the trust this represents," he told her. She looked at him and answered, "I only hope it doesn't wound anyone beyond repair." Then she sat. Across the table, Camilla looked directly at her. That single glance told Sophie her fear had been justified. Charles had settled the question of authority, but the emotional reckoning was only beginning. The music continued. Crystal glasses were raised. Speeches were delivered exactly as rehearsed. Yet everyone close enough to the royal table could feel that something was wrong. Sophie sat beside Charles with almost painful composure, while Camilla occupied a seat from which she could see them both. Nothing dramatic needed to happen. The silence itself became the drama, and then one small gesture exposed just how deeply the decision had landed. Sophie understood that every movement would be judged. The royal table, meaning the principal table reserved for the most senior members of the family and their distinguished guests, had become the emotional center of the entire banquet. Courtiers whispered carefully. Relatives avoided staring. She spoke to Charles only when necessary, and repeatedly drew neighboring guests into the conversation, determined not to look triumphant. The trusted confidant had received the place of honor, but she seemed almost burdened by it. Camilla felt every glance. When an attendant reached forward to refill her glass, she noticed two guests quickly look away. The queen consort understood what they were waiting for. Anger, embarrassment, some visible crack in her control. She forced a smile and thanked the attendant calmly. Inside, the humiliation deepened. This was supposed to be an evening celebrating partnership and continuity. Instead, she felt like everyone had been invited to witness the exact moment her influence had been measured against another woman's. Charles saw the strain immediately. The king caught Camilla's expression more than once and felt guilt push against his resolve. He knew reversing the arrangement now would spare his wife some pain, but it would also humiliate Sophie and reduce his own decision to panic. He had made the choice deliberately. He would not sacrifice one woman simply to quiet the anger of another. Then Charles rose to speak. The room settled as the monarch thanked those who had served, without needing recognition before service. Sophie lowered her eyes. Camilla did not move. She recognized the phrase for what it was. An echo of Windsor, of that argument over the retiring staff, of the moment Sophie had said, "Gratitude mattered too." The wound became sharper because the message was no longer private. William understood it as well. The prince knew that sentence had survived every revision of the speech. His father had kept it, because it captured the principle behind the entire evening. This was no longer just a seating choice. Charles was defining how he wanted his final ceremonial chapter remembered. Camilla quietly placed her napkin beside her plate before dessert. Then she stood and left the table for several minutes. Catherine noticed Sophie staring at the empty chair with distress rather than satisfaction. When the banquet ended, the trusted confidant ignored the congratulations around her. She went looking for Camilla. The palace expected the final toast to close the night. Instead, Sophie walked straight toward the one conversation that could either heal the wound or deepen it beyond repair. There were no aides in the room, no protocol officers to soften the language, and no king present to decide who was right. Sophie found Camilla alone after the banquet, still carrying the expression she had worn through dinner, but no longer trying to hide it. For the first time that night, the two women faced each other without ceremony. What followed did not erase the insult, but it changed the meaning of the conflict. Sophie had deliberately avoided the reception line, the formal moment when senior royals greet departing guests after a major event. She did not want congratulations. She wanted to find Camilla before silence hardened into resentment. The queen consort had withdrawn to a private sitting room away from the celebration, and when Sophie entered, she immediately sensed that the conversation could go badly. Camilla looked at her and assumed the purpose was obvious. She asked whether Sophie had come to explain Charles to her. The trusted confidant answered that she had not come to defend the king at all. She had come because walking away without speaking would make the evening worse. Camilla listened, but her expression remained guarded. Sophie told her plainly that she had never wanted the seat. She understood how it must have felt to watch someone else occupy a place associated so closely with marriage, rank, and partnership. Camilla shook her head. Whether Sophie wanted it, she said, was never the point. The real pain came from discovering that Charles wanted her there. Camilla then admitted something far more difficult. The banquet had forced her to face a fear she had been avoiding for months. Charles could love her deeply as his wife, while trusting someone else more in certain matters of duty. Personal loyalty and institutional confidence were no longer the same thing, and that distinction terrified her. Sophie answered with a revelation of her own, but she sourced it directly to a private conversation with Charles before the banquet. She had offered to decline the seat. The king refused. He believed backing away would destroy the message he wanted the evening to carry. Camilla expected Sophie to use that confession as proof of victory. Instead, she did the opposite. The trusted confidant told her that one chair could not erase decades of partnership. Trust inside the monarchy, she said, was not a prize that only one woman could possess. Camilla finally asked the question she had been resisting. "Do you think I failed him at Windsor?" Sophie paused. "I think you hurt something he cares deeply about." Camilla looked down, then slowly nodded. That was the turning point. She would not challenge the banquet publicly. She would not demand Sophie be pushed aside. But by morning, their private understanding would collide with something far louder. One photograph that made the entire country believe it had witnessed a transfer of royal influence. By sunrise, the banquet had acquired a life far beyond the palace walls. One photograph dominated front pages. Charles seated calmly at the center of the table, Sophie immediately beside him, and Camilla visibly separated several places away. No caption was needed to explain why the picture mattered. Britain saw hierarchy, marriage, duty, and royal favor compressed into a single frame. What the palace had experienced as private tension was suddenly being judged as public symbolism. The story moved faster than anyone inside the household expected. Newspapers ignored the menu, the foreign guests, and even most of Charles's speech. Broadcasters focused on one question: why had Sophie been placed beside the king while Camilla sat farther away? Royal commentators began treating the seating plan as evidence of a transfer of influence. A seating plan, simply the official arrangement showing where guests are placed at a formal event, had suddenly become the most discussed royal document in Britain. One morning edition pushed the drama further. Its front page carried the fictional headline, "Sophie at the King's Side," above the banquet photograph showing Charles speaking quietly to her, while Camilla remained several places away. Copies were held up outside Buckingham Palace as television crews broadcast live. The image was simple, but the meaning people attached to it was enormous. The crowd outside the gates quickly turned that meaning into conversation. One older woman, speaking during a live broadcast, looked toward the palace and said Sophie looked like she was there to serve the evening, not own it. The phrase spread rapidly through morning coverage. What had begun as one stranger's reaction suddenly became a summary of the entire story. Sophie hated that interpretation. At breakfast, she told Edward the coverage made it sound as though she had defeated Camilla in some private contest. The trusted confidant reminded her husband that only hours earlier, she had been sitting alone with the queen consort, trying to prevent exactly that kind of division. Edward told her public symbolism rarely captured private pain. Camilla saw the same headline alone. She read it once, folded the paper closed, and remained silent. The queen understood something she had resisted the night before. Challenging Charles publicly now would not restore her dignity. It would only make the humiliation larger. Charles faced pressure as well. Advisors suggested a clarifying statement that could soften Sophie's role and calm speculation. The king refused. He said the seating reflected his wishes and would not be rewritten after the fact. That refusal settled the public argument, but not the private one. The world had already delivered its verdict from a single photograph. Inside the palace, Charles still owed Sophie and Camilla something more important than any headline: a final explanation of what his choice truly meant and what it never meant at all. When the noise finally faded, Charles gathered Sophie and Camilla not as symbols, rivals, or competing royal women, but as two people whose loyalty had shaped different parts of his life. The banquet had exposed wounds he never intended to deepen, yet he refused to pretend the decision had been meaningless. His final explanation would settle what the chair beside him represented, and why Sophie's presence there had never required Camilla's complete rejection. Charles called them together the following day, with no advisors and no senior officials present. He wanted the matter settled personally, not through palace machinery. The king explained that his final banquet had been built around one principle: recognizing long service that often went unnoticed. Ceremonial recognition, meaning an official public honor, expressed through position or protocol, had mattered, because he wanted the evening to say something deeper than rank alone could express. Camilla listened without interrupting. Charles told the queen consort that choosing Sophie had never been a rejection of their marriage, their history, or everything they had endured together. He admitted the manner of the decision had hurt her more than he intended. He should have spoken to her earlier. The king did not withdraw the choice, but he accepted responsibility for the pain created by his silence. Sophie heard something different. Charles told the trusted confidant that her value had never come from replacing another person. It came from serving without constantly asking what service would return to her. She had not chased elevation. She had not demanded reward. And that, he said, was why the chair beside him had carried such meaning. Charles finally made the message unmistakable. Sophie had received the place of honor because she represented the principle he wanted attached to the monarchy that evening. Duty before entitlement, gratitude before convenience, service before status. The king was not naming a new favorite, he was defining a standard. Camilla turned towards Sophie after a long silence. She told Charles she understood what he had meant, even if she still hated how painfully the lesson had arrived. Then the queen looked directly at the other woman and said she would not hold that chair against her. Sophie answered quietly that she had never wanted to possess it beyond that night. That ended the battle. Camilla accepted the decision. Sophie returned to her normal role without claiming any new permanent position. Charles preserved both relationships, but none of them walked away unchanged. The banquet would be remembered not as the night one woman defeated another, but as the night the king drew a final distinction between title and trust. Sophie left honored but humbled. Camilla left wounded but no longer threatened. Charles left having made his principle unmistakable. The seat beside the king belonged to Sophie for one evening. The message belonged to the monarchy. Royal importance could be inherited. Royal trust still had to be earned. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.